I never believed in the hollow feeling people talk about, that cliche of the hair standing up on your neck, or the sensation that someone is watching you from the velvet darkness of an empty room. I always thought fear was just mechanics, a standard biological response, an adrenaline spike to sharpen the dull senses of the modern human. I was wrong. True fear isn't a spike. It doesn't heighten your senses, it drowns them. True fear is a dissolution, a slow and agonizing realization that your own skin is no longer a private residence. It is the understanding that your physical form is merely a container, and something else has found the key. My name doesn't matter anymore. Why was doesn't matter? What matters is the humming. It started with the humming. It wasn't a sound you could hear with your ears, no. It was a vibration in the molars, a resonance in the deepest marrow of my long bones. I first noticed it on a rainy Tuesday in November. I was sitting in my fourth floor apartment, watching the water streak the glass like liquid scar tissue. The city outside was a muted blur, but inside my skull, a frequency was establishing itself. Humming. I remember rubbing my jaw, thinking it was perhaps a cavity or stress making me grind my teeth. But when I held my fingers to my wrist, my pulse was slow and steady. The humming was disjointed from my biology. It was alien. It felt industrial. As the nights passed, the frequency shifted. It grew from a dull ache to a pervasive presence. I would lie in bed, surrounded by the heavy silence of the building, but my skeleton was vibrating like a tuning fork. It made it impossible to sleep. If I closed my eyes, the thrum grew louder, moving from my teeth up into the soft tissue behind my sockets. The pressure began to build. I became obsessed with grounding myself. I would press my palms flat against the cold concrete floor of my kitchen, just to feel something that was still. I took scalding showers until my skin was raw and bright red, trying to wash away the sensation of being energized from within. But you can't wash away the marrow in your bones. A full week of this, and the hallucinations began. In the periphery of my vision, I started seeing the flaws in the world. The edges of doors wouldn't look perfectly straight, they would ripple. The static on the television, when I couldn't find a clear channel, didn't look like electronic noise. It looked like patterns. It looked like people moving just beneath the surface of the screen, pressing their faces against the glass, screaming soundlessly. The first real breach happened at a coffee shop on 5th Street. It was morning. The place was bustling with people, commuters clutching travel mugs, the steam rising like small sacrifices to the god of the work week. The smell of roasted beans was overwhelming, usually comforting, but today it smelled wrong. Metallic, like copper and old blood. I was standing in line when the humming suddenly peaked. It became so intense it blurred my vision. My ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the chatter of the crowd and the hiss of the espresso machines. I had to bite down on my tongue, hard, to keep from screaming. I could taste the sharp tang of my own blood. And then, I saw him. A man was standing near the pickup counter. He was utterly unremarkable, wearing a gray tweed coat, a leather satchel slung over his shoulder, checking his phone. Just another ghost in the machine of the city. But the energy radiating off of him was painful. To everyone else, he looked normal. But to me, his outline was jagged, unstable. I watched him. The screaming in my teeth was so loud, I couldn't form a coherent thought. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the man tilted his head. It wasn't a natural movement. His neck extended, the tendons snapping into sharp relief, shifting at an angle that should have resulted in the audible crack of vertebra. There was no sound, only the sudden, unnatural silence that now inhabited my mind. He turned his gaze directly toward me. His eyes, my God, his eyes. They weren't evil. That is a word for people who still have a choice. His eyes were occupied. The warm human brown was pushed back, drowning in a rising tide of flat, oil, slick blackness. The pupils didn't dilate or contract. They were fixed, frozen black beads. I was looking into a pair of windows to a space that contained no life. He didn't move toward me. He didn't threaten. He just opened his mouth. It didn't look like he was preparing to speak. He dropped his jaw farther than is anatomically possible, the skin at the corners of his lips stretching until it was as thin and pale as tissue paper. The inside of his mouth wasn't pink or red. It was a void. A thick, viscous, oily vapor. Not smoke, but something with weight began to seep from his throat. It coiled into the air, a bruised purple-black mist that smelled of ozone and wet earth. It didn't dissipate. It clung together, taking on a form that my mind refused to process. Help! The word didn't come from his mouth. It came from the air around him. It was a wet, gurgling sound, the sound of a man drowning in his own chest cavity. I was the only one who saw. Everyone else continued their morning dance. They ordered drinks. They laughed. They checked their emails. They were blind to the nightmare occurring 10 feet away from them. The man in the gray coat then did the final thing. He took his left hand, and with a casual, almost absent-minded motion, he gripped his own lower jaw, and he tightened his grip. I saw the white of his knuckles. I saw the skin of his face begin to tear under the pressure of his own fingernails. The sound was like wet Velcro being ripped apart, followed instantly by the heavy, rhythmic thud of the leather satchel hitting the floor. It was a finality, a statement of conclusion. Nobody in the shop reacted, not even the barista who had been reaching to place his drink on the counter. The world seemed to have paused for everyone but me. I watched, frozen, a prisoner to the horror of what was unfolding in that bright, mundane space. The man didn't collapse immediately. His body remained standing, even as his face was being dismantled from the within. The vapor I had seen, the coiled, oily thing, wasn't just leaving him. It was using his internal pressure, his own panic, as a launch pad. I could see the spirit, the intruder, moving just beneath the surface of his skin. It looked like thick, black sludge pumping through his arteries, causing his face to bulge and distort like water in a rubber glove. He made one last attempt to speak, another gurgling help, but this time it was choked off as his esophagus collapsed, crushed by the occupying force. The spirit wasn't killing him to destroy him. It was harvesting him. It was pushing all of his remaining life force, his fear, his very essence, up through his throat and into the coiling mist outside. With a final, sickening crunch, the man's posture broke. He didn't fall forward or back. He just surrendered. His skeletal system seemed to turn to liquid, and he crumpled onto the floor in a heap of wool and meat. The mist didn't dissipate when his body became still. It expanded. It took on a vague, arachnid shape, but with too many limbs and a head that was just a vortex of shifting darkness. It looked at me with his dead eyes, which were now just holes in the mask of his face, and I felt it. I felt the connection. The humming in my own bones skyrocketed. A spike of cold, oily pressure drove itself up my spine, settling at the base of my skull. It felt like someone had driven an icicle into my nervous system. I was the grounding point. It was using me to anchor itself to this reality. I broke. I turned and bolted for the door, knocking over a table, sending cups shatter into the floor. Now they noticed. "Hey, watch it," someone yelled. "Is that guy okay?" Another asked, looking toward the slumped man in the gray coat. They were moving. They were reacting, but their words sounded slow, distorted, like they were speaking from the bottom of a deep lake. I burst out of the coffee shop, into the cold November air. It was sharp, but it didn't feel real. It felt like a stage prop. I ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed distance. I needed the screaming in my teeth to stop. I ran until my lungs burned with the sensation of inhaled glass. My heart was a frantic, trapped bird, hammering against my ribs, terrified it was about to be crushed. I stopped in an alleyway 3 blocks away, collapsing against a dumpster. The smell of garbage was a welcome distraction from the metallic tang that still coated my tongue. That was 3 nights ago. I haven't slept since. I'm in my apartment now. The furniture is all stacked against the front door. The windows are taped shut, blacking out the city. I'm living in a tomb I built for myself. But it doesn't matter. The barricades are useless. The humming, the vibration in my marrow, it just stopped. And now, I feel heavy. Something is sitting at the base of my spine. It's cold, it's coiled, and it's starting to unfold. The shift happened at exactly 3:17 a.m. I know the time because the red glow of my digital clock was the only thing left in my world. A jagged wound of light in the darkness. The heaviness at the base of my spine suddenly released. But it didn't leave. It expanded. It felt like thick, cold molasses was flooding my abdominal cavity. I couldn't breathe. I tried to gasp, but my diaphragm refused to respond. It was occupied. It was as if my internal organs were being rearranged by invisible, freezing hands. The entity, the spirit, began to map my nervous system. I felt it in real time. It was like a map of pain was being drawn inside me. It stretched from my spine down into my legs, claiming my femur, my patella, my tibia. Then it moved up, seizing my ribs, my shoulder blades, and finally my arms. Testing the machinery, my left hand suddenly snapped shut, a fist so tight I could feel the tendons stretching to their absolute limit. I hadn't made that fist. My brain hadn't sent that signal. I watched my own hand in the dim red light. My index finger uncurled, slowly, jerkily, like a rusted piston. It pointed directly at my own face. Then came the thought. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a sound. It was a pure concept that exploded in the center of my brain. Vessel. Ready. The entity wasn't malicious in the way a human is malicious. Malice requires effort. This was just function. I was a tool that had been sharpened and was now ready to be used. I forced myself up from the floor. My movements were awkward and disjointed. I didn't feel my legs move. I just observed the change in my perspective as the entity manipulated the muscles. I was a passenger in a suit of meat. I stumbled toward the bathroom. I needed to see what I had become. The mirror over the sink was small and cracked. I didn't turn on the light. The ambient red from the bedroom was enough to show me the ruin of my face. My eyes were gone, not missing, but entirely replaced by that flat, void blackness. My pupils were gone. My iris was gone. There was just black oil behind my eyelids. My skin was pale, nearly translucent, and I could see the black lines of my veins pulsing like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. The entity suddenly shifted its weight. It forced my body to lean over the sink. It gripped the edges of the porcelain so hard, I heard the ceramic begin to creak. And then, the pain. It was an exquisite, blinding agony that started in the core of my chest. It felt like someone had driven a hook into my sternum and was pulling, hard. I opened my mouth, a reflex of pain. The oily vapor, the medium of the entity, began to seep from my throat. It didn't coil this time. It just poured into the sink, a heavy, silent river of darkness. As the vapor left my body, my mind began to clear. I realized I was becoming lighter. The terrible, oppressive weight was lifting. For a brief, hopeful second, I thought I was dying, that this was the end, and I would be free. I was wrong again. It wasn't leaving. It was dividing. I was standing, but I was empty. The entity had withdrawn the vast majority of its substance from my physical form. I could breathe again, but the air felt thin, useless. I felt like a paper doll, a fragile structure that could be collapsed by a stiff breeze. My bones no longer vibrated, but my entire skeletal structure felt porous, weak. I was hollow. I was also no longer alone in the bathroom. The river of black vapor that had poured from my throat was now filling the small space. It wasn't sitting still. It was rolling and coiling, a living, heavy storm contained within 4 tiled walls. It didn't form a creature. It didn't try to impersonate a human. It was just an environment, a pocket dimension of shadow and cold. And then, I saw the faces. Within the swirling mist, shapes began to form. Faces, hundreds of them. They weren't solid, but they were distinct. The man in the gray coat, a woman with short hair, an old man, children. They were all staring at me. Their mouths were open in silent screams. Their eyes were the same black pits as mine. They were the past residents. The entity didn't destroy souls. It collected them. We were the fuel, the battery that kept it anchored to this reality. We were the static in its transmission. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The spirit, it wasn't a single entity. It was a hive mind of the damned, a procession of the hollow, all seeking the one thing we can no longer have: life. I understood then that I had been chosen not for death, but for service. We are many. The thought echoed in my hollow skull. It wasn't a whisper. It was a choir of agony. You are one. The mist began to coalesce around me. It didn't enter my mouth or nose. It absorbed into my skin. It filled the gaps. It replaced my missing weight with a weight of its own. A cold, oily pressure that felt like the deepest parts of the ocean. I was no longer just the driver. I was the vehicle, and the fuel tank was full. My body moved with a terrifying grace I had never possessed. The entity was no longer just operating the controls. It was the machine. It forced me back into the main room. We approached the stacked furniture barricade. With a simple, fluid motion of my left hand, I swept the heavy oak dresser and the chairs aside. They flew across the room and shattered against the wall with a thunderous crash. The entity didn't need to struggle. Physics didn't matter to it. The entity wanted out. It was time for it to feed again. I opened the apartment door and stepped into the quiet, carpeted hallway of my building. It was 3:45 a.m. The world was still asleep, vulnerable in its dreams. I walked down the hall, my steps making no sound. The entity had muted the world again. I didn't feel my own heartbeat. I didn't feel the air in my lungs. I was a ghost occupying my own skin. We stopped in front of apartment 404, Sarah's apartment. She was a nice woman, always smiled in the elevator. She had a little terrier named Buster, who was always excited to see people. The entity extended my right hand. The fingers were now tipped with those long, oily needles of shadow I'd seen back in the subway. We didn't knock. We just pressed. The shadow needles passed through the wood of the door as if it were a holographic projection. The metal of the lock didn't snap. It dissolved. It simply turned to rust and dust, crumbling under the entity's touch. The door swung open silently. The apartment was warm, a contrast to the icy void that now filled me. I could smell the faint scent of Sarah's lavender shampoo. Buster, the terrier, didn't bark. He was standing in the hallway, looking toward us, but his tiny body was shivering, his tail tucked between his legs. He didn't see a human. He saw the mist, and he was too terrified to make a sound. We ignored the dog. We moved into the bedroom. Sarah was asleep, a peaceful expression on her face. Her breathing was rhythmic, a soft counterpoint to the absolute silence of the entity. This is life. The entity seemed to almost savor the thought. We stood over her. The coiling black mist began to seep from my skin, filling the air above her bed, forming that bruised, oily thundercloud. Sarah stirred. The change in air pressure, the drop in temperature, it was enough to pierce her sleep. She opened her eyes. She didn't scream, not at first. Her eyes were wide, taking in the impossible sight of the swirling darkness above her, and the man she knew as her neighbor standing in the red glow of the street lamp, his face a mask of void. She looked from a mist back to me, and I saw the moment her reality broke. I saw the exact second when her mind realized that the rules of the world had changed. The absolute, paralyzing panic that sets in when you're no longer in control. It was delicious. That wasn't my thought. That was the entity's thought. But I felt it too. I felt the rush of power, the energy that came from her terror. We were feeding. Her chest began to heave. She opened her mouth to scream, but the entity was faster. We extended our hand, and we didn't touch her. We just opened our mouth. The main river of vapor poured from our throat and entered hers. Sarah's body immediately convulsed. A violent, arching spasm. The spirit wasn't trying to reside in her. It was extracting the anchor. Her skin began to turn gray, then translucent. The black lines of her veins appeared, just like mine had. But she wasn't becoming hollow. She was being digested. Her soul, her memory, her very essence was being broken down into its base components and added to the mist. We watched. We absorbed. We were whole for the first time in centuries. We had meaning. We had purpose. We were the procession of the hollow, and the procession would continue. The transformation of Sarah was not quiet, not in the way the man in the gray coat had been. In the enclosed space of apartment 404, the energy was volatile. I watched through my oil-black eyes as her life was siphoned into the mist. Her fingers clawed at the bed sheets, leaving long, jagged tears in the fabric. Her heels drummed against the mattress in a frantic, uneven rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. The entity didn't care about the noise. It was gorging. Every vibration of her vocal cords, every frantic pulse of her failing heart was a delicacy. It took her memories first. I felt them pass through me like cold static. I saw a flash of a summer day, a birthday cake with 7 candles, the smell of rain on hot asphalt. Then they were gone, deleted, consumed. Her body began to shrivel. It wasn't just death. It was a total structural collapse. The moisture in her skin evaporated, leaving behind a gray, parchment-like husk. The black vapor coiled tighter and tighter around her, until she was nothing more than a silhouette of shadow. And then, she was gone. The bed was empty. Not even a stain remained. The only evidence of Sarah's existence was the lingering scent of lavender, and the terrified whimpering of the dog in the hallway. We are stronger. The thought was a roar now. It shook my ribs. It made my vision pulse with a dark, violet light. The entity moved my legs. We turned away from the empty bed and walked back into the living room. Buster, the terrier, was backed into a corner. He wasn't growling anymore. He was just shaking, his small heart beating so fast I could hear it from across the room. The entity paused. It looked at the dog. I felt a surge of curiosity. No, it was simpler. It was an assessment of energy. The dog was too small, too simple. There was no complexity to its fear, no depth to its memory. It wasn't worth the effort of consumption. We walked past him. We reached the front door of Sarah's apartment and stepped back into the hallway. But we didn't go back to my unit. We turned toward the elevator. The humming of my teeth had returned, but it was different now. It wasn't a warning. It was a search grid. I could feel the building breathing. I could feel the heat signatures of the other residents through the walls. To the entity, the apartment complex wasn't a home. It was a vending machine. We pressed the button for the elevator. The metal was cold against my skin, but I didn't feel the cold. I felt the conductivity. I felt the electricity flowing through the wires, the hum of the motor in the shaft. The door slid open with a soft, mechanical hiss. I stepped inside. The mirrors on the elevator walls showed me again. I looked like a smudge in reality, a man-shaped hole where a light went to die. I watched my reflection. My jaw was hanging slightly open, and a thin, constant stream of black vapor was trickling from my bottom lip, like a leak in a pressurized tank. The entity chose a button. 412. The penthouse. Mr. Henderson lived there, the man who owned the building, a man with a large family, a large life, and a very large ego. The entity liked ego. It was a dense, heavy form of energy. As the elevator rose, I felt the entity stretching. It was expanding its reach, pushing its influence through the ventilation ducts into the electrical outlets. A woman on the 8th floor woke up suddenly, clutching her throat. A child on the 10th floor began to cry, complaining of a buzzing in his ears. We were a virus, and the building was already infected. The doors opened on the 12th floor. The carpet here was thicker. The air smelled of expensive cigars and lemon polish. It was quiet, too quiet. We walked toward the double doors at the end of the hall. We didn't need to dissolve the lock this time. The entity simply reached through. My arm didn't hit the wood. It phased through the molecules, the shadow matter of the entity bypassing the physical world entirely. I felt the coldness of the interior of the door, the dead space between the panels. And then we were inside. The Henderson suite was sprawling. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, the lights of the skyline flickering like dying embers. In the master bedroom, 3 people were sleeping. Mr. Henderson, his wife, and their youngest daughter, who must have had a nightmare and crawled into bed with them. The entity stopped in the doorway. It didn't rush in. It began to uncoil. The black mist poured out of my every pore. It filled the hallway. It spilled over the expensive rugs. It climbed the walls like a rising tide of ink. I felt myself becoming lighter again. The hollow sensation returned. But this time, it was accompanied by a sense of purpose. We weren't just eating. We were recruiting. The mist reached the edge of the bed. It didn't wait for them to wake up. It didn't need their awareness. It only needed their marrow. The daughter was the first. She was young. Her bones were soft. The resonance hit her like a physical blow. She sat up, her eyes snapping open. But she didn't see the room. She saw the void. She didn't even have time to gasp. The vapor surged into her mouth, her nose, her ears. She turned gray in seconds. Her small body stiffened, her back arching, her fingers splaying out like the legs of a dying insect. Then, the father. Mr. Henderson woke up to the sound of his daughter's bones snapping as her ribcage expanded to accommodate the mist. He saw the blackness. He saw me standing in the doorway, a silhouette of ruin. He tried to reach for the phone on the nightstand. I moved, not the mist, me. The entity snapped my body forward with a speed that defied gravity. I was across the room in a heartbeat. I grabbed his wrist. The sound of his bones shattering was the loudest thing in the room. Crack. He screamed, a raw, ragged sound that was cut short as I shoved my hand, covered in the oily shadow, directly into his open mouth. I didn't pull away. I held him there. I felt his teeth sinking into my skin, but it didn't hurt. It felt like a distant tickle. I watched as the blackness flowed from my arm, through my palm, and into his throat. I watched his eyes turn from blue to gray to that flat, empty black. We are becoming. The wife was last. She didn't even try to fight. She just stared at the 2 husks that used to be her family, and she waited for the shadow to take her. When a mist finally cleared, the bedroom was empty. But I wasn't alone. 3 new shapes were standing in the room with me. They were vague, flickering silhouettes of the Hendersons. They weren't ghosts. They were SUB stations. The entity had divided itself again. It was now operating 4 bodies at once. We turned as one. We walked toward the door. The building had 300 residents. By sunrise, the building would be a hive. And I was just the first cell. The sun didn't rise over the city. It merely stained the sky a sickly, bruised gray. Inside the building, the air had become a pressurized soup of ozone and decay. We stood in the lobby, 4 of us, a small, silent congregation of the hollow. I was the center, the original vessel, while the 3 Hendersons stood behind me, their movements perfectly synchronized with mine. The building was no longer a structure of brick and glass. It was a living organism. The entity had threaded itself through the copper wiring, the plumbing, the very drywall. I could feel every heartbeat in every apartment. I could feel the fear of the few who hadn't been consumed yet. Those who were hiding under beds, clutching useless crosses and cell phones with no signal. The signal was gone. The entity didn't just eat flesh, it ate the waves. It absorbed the radio frequencies, the Wi-Fi, the cellular data. We were a dead zone in the middle of a screaming metropolis. At 7:15 a.m., the first police cruiser pulled up to the curb. They were responding to a 911 call that had been cut short. A woman on the 5th floor who had managed to scream one word before the vapor reached her throat. Help! I watched them from the lobby windows. 2 officers, young, confident. They adjusted their belts, checked their body cams, and walked toward the glass doors. They didn't see me, not at first. I was standing in the shadows of the concierge desk, my skin the color of wet ash, my eyes 2 holes of midnight. They pulled on the door. It was locked. Officer 1 knocked on the glass, his face pressed against the surface. Hey, anyone in there? He shouted. I stepped forward. The light from the street hit my face. I saw the officer's expression shift from professional concern to confusion to absolute, bone-shattering terror. His hand went to his holster, but his fingers wouldn't move. The entity had already reached him. The humming in my teeth became a reptilian hiss. It wasn't coming from my mouth. It was coming from the pavement beneath his feet. The black vapor didn't seep out this time. It jumped. A jagged bolt of oily shadow shot from the crack under the door. It hit the officer in the chest, passing through his Kevlar vest as if it were smoke. He didn't fall. He froze. His partner, Officer 2, screamed and drew his weapon. He fired 3 rounds into the glass. Bang, bang, bang. The glass spiderwebbed, but it didn't shatter. The entity was holding the molecules together, reinforcing the barrier with its own weight. I watched the bullets. They didn't ricochet. They hit the glass and simply stopped. They hung there, suspended in the air, turning to rust before they could even hit the ground. Officer 2 scrambled backward, reaching for his radio. Dispatch, we have a code 3. We need backup. He stammered. His radio didn't produce a voice. It produced a gurgle, the sound of Sarah's death, the sound of Mr. Henderson's bones snapping. The first officer, the one hit by the shadow, finally moved. He didn't turn to help his partner. He turned to the police cruiser. He gripped the door handle and pulled. The metal groaned. The hinges screamed as they were forced past their limit. He ripped the door off the car and tossed it into the middle of the street like a piece of crumpled paper. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a transmitter. He opened his mouth, and the bruised purple mist poured out into the city air. It didn't coil. It didn't wait. It caught the morning breeze and began to drift toward the subway entrance across the street. The entity wasn't content with the building. It wanted the nerve center, inside the lobby. I felt the entity's satisfaction. It was a cold, humming vibration that made my skin itch. We are expanding. I looked at my hands. They were changing again. The skin was beginning to peel away, revealing not muscle or bone, but a dense, pulsing mesh of black fibers. I wasn't a human being in a suit of meat. I was a silhouette being filled with the void. Officer 2 was still on the sidewalk, weeping, his gun pointed at his own partner. Don't, please, stay back, he begged. The first officer didn't stay back. He walked forward, his movements jerky, his neck tilted at that impossible angle. He didn't use his gun. He used his hands. He reached out and gripped Officer 2 by the temples. The sound was like a dry branch snapping in winter. Officer 2's eyes rolled back, the blue iris dissolving into the black oil. He didn't die. He was recruited. Now there were 6 of us. But as the mist reached the subway entrance, I felt the number jump. 10, 50, 100. Down in the tunnels, The morning commuters were being greeted by the vapor. The trains were stopping. The lights were flickering. The city was beginning to hum. I turned away from the glass. The entity wanted me to go deeper. There were still residents in the building who were resisting. There was still energy to be harvested. I walked toward the stairs. My feet didn't touch the carpet. I was gliding, a ghost of a new world. I reached the third floor, apartment 312. A young mother and her baby. I could hear her heart. It was a frantic, irregular beat. Thump, thump, thump. She was hiding in the bathtub, the door locked, the shower curtain drawn. She was whispering a prayer. The entity laughed through my throat. It was a dry, rattling sound. Prayer is just noise. I walked through the door. Literally, my body softened, becoming a liquid shadow, and I flowed through the wood. I stood in the bathroom. The air was cold. My presence was a frost that covered the tiles. I reached out and pulled back the shower curtain. The woman looked up. She didn't scream. Her voice was gone. Her vocal cords had already been paralyzed by the resonance. She hugged her baby tighter. I opened my mouth. I felt the vapor rising. It was heavy. It was hungry. But for the first time, a flicker of something else sparked in the back of my mind. A memory. A woman's face. Not this woman. Someone from my past. A name. I couldn't remember the name. The entity felt the flicker. It didn't like the resistance. It slammed my mind against the back of my skull. A spike of blinding. White-hot pain. Vessel. Silence. The memory was crushed. The face was deleted. I was hollow again. I leaned over the tub. I opened my jaws. The mist poured out. The mother and the child didn't disappear. They became part of the mist. They joined the choir. I stepped out of the bathroom. The building was nearly empty now. The energy was peaking. I walked to the window at the end of the hallway. I looked out over the city. The black vapor was everywhere. It was rising from the sewers, pouring from the windows, coiling around skyscrapers. The sky was no longer gray. It was black. The city was no longer New York. It was a cathedral of the hollow, and the service was just beginning. The city was no longer breathing. It was humming from the 12th floor of the Henderson building. The world below looked like a slow-motion drowning. The black vapor didn't just stay in streets. It climbed. It licked at the sides of the skyscrapers like a rising tide of ink, seeping into the sealed environments of the office towers. I stood at the window, my fingers pressing against the glass. The glass didn't crack. It vibrated. Every pane of glass in the city was now a speaker for the entity. I could hear the collective. Thousands of minds, thousands of screams, all compressed into a single, low-frequency thrum. It was the sound of a billion neurons being overwritten. It was the sound of the world being reformatted. I looked down at the street. The traffic had stopped. Cars were piled into each other, steam rising from their crushed radiators. But there were no people running. There was no chaos. There was only the march. Hundreds of the hollow were emerging from the buildings. They moved with that same jerky, synchronized grace. Some were still clutching briefcases. Some were wearing pajamas. Some were dressed in the high-vis vests of construction workers. They weren't looking at each other. They didn't need to. They were all cells in the same body. We are the city. The thought didn't just echo in my head. It shook the floor. It felt like the foundations of the building were shifting. The entity was no longer just using me as a vessel. It was using the infrastructure. I felt the power grid surge. The street lights, even in the daylight, flickered and flared with a blinding, violet intensity. Transformers on the poles began to explode, one by one, sending showers of sparks into the black mist. But the lights didn't go out. The entity was feeding the wires. It was replacing the electricity with its own oily resonance. The city was glowing from within. I turned away from the window. My body felt light, almost translucent. I could see the wall behind my hand through my own skin. The transition was nearly complete. I was becoming the mist. The Hendersons were gone. They had drifted out of the room, merging with the larger cloud that was now pulsing in the hallways. I was the only one left in the penthouse. Or so I thought. A sound. A real sound. Not the humming. Not the resonance. A wet, ragged cough. It came from the master bathroom. The entity moved my legs. We glided across the expensive carpet, our shadow stretching out before us like a predatory wing. I pushed the door open. Mr. Henderson's oldest son, a boy of maybe 19, was huddled in the corner of the marble shower. He had a wet towel wrapped around his face. His eyes were bloodshot, weeping, but they weren't black. He was still human. He looked up at me. He didn't have a weapon. He was clutching a plastic bottle of bleach. Stay back. He wheezed. His voice was a ruin. The resonance had already shredded his throat, but he was still holding on. I looked at him. For a second, just a fraction of a heartbeat. The entity hesitated. It wasn't mercy. It was calculation. The boy was a survivor. He had a genetic resistance. Or perhaps his sheer, desperate will to live was creating a barrier the vapor couldn't penetrate. The entity liked a challenge. I opened my mouth, but I didn't let the vapor out. I spoke. The sound was like two stones grinding together at the bottom of a well. Join, U.S. The boy screamed. It was a high, thin sound that broke into a sob. He threw the bottle of bleach at me. It passed through my chest. Literally, the plastic bottle went through my ribs as if I were a projection on a screen. It hit the wall behind me and shattered, the chemical smell filling the air. I didn't blink. I didn't feel the bleach. I walked forward. The boy tried to scramble up the marble wall, but there was nowhere to go. I reached out. My hand was no longer a hand. It was a cluster of black, needle-like shadows. I touched his forehead. The resonance hit him like a lightning bolt. His body stiffened. His eyes went wide. I felt his memories rushing into me. A flood of trivial, human things. A girl he liked in high school. The feeling of a cold beer on a Friday night. The fear of his father's disapproval. I watched as the blackness crept across his retinas. I watched as his individuality was stripped away, layer by layer, until there was nothing left but the hollow. He stopped shaking. He stood up. His movements were now my movements. He tilted his head at the same angle I did. We are complete. We said in unison. The sound of our combined voices shattered the bathroom mirror. We turned and walked out of the penthouse. We didn't use the elevator. We walked to the edge of the roof. The city lay before us, a landscape of shadow and violet fire. The black mist was now so thick it was blotting out the sun entirely. It was an artificial night. I looked toward the horizon. The mist wasn't stopping at the city limits. It was flowing across the bridges, moving over the water like a carpet of oil. The entity wasn't just taking a city. It was taking the world. And I was the one who opened the door. I felt a final, tiny spark of the man I used to be. A small, flickering candle in the middle of a hurricane. I tried to remember my name one last time. I couldn't. The candle went out. There was only the humming. There was only the void. The world was no longer a place of sound. It was a place of pressure, standing on the edge of the Henderson roof. I watched the black tide roll over the Brooklyn Bridge. From this height, the cars looked like scattered beads on a string, their headlights flickering out one by one as the mist swallowed them. The entity was breathing through the city vents. Every subway grate, every chimney, every open window was an exhalation of the void. I looked at the boy beside me. He wasn't a boy anymore. He was a mirror. He stood exactly as I stood, his chin tilted, his fingers twitching in the same rhythmic, industrial pattern. We were a chorus of two, but as I looked out of the skyline, I saw them on every rooftop, on every balcony. Shapes were emerging. Thousands of us. The hollow were taking their positions. We were a forest of shadows, rooted in the concrete, reaching for the black sky. The humming in my teeth became a tearing sensation. It wasn't pain. It was a rupture. The entity was shifting its focus. It was no longer interested in individual vessels. It was building a network, I felt the connection snap into place. I wasn't just seeing through my eyes anymore. I was seeing through the eyes of the officer on the street. I was seeing through the eyes of the mother in the bathtub. I was seeing through the eyes of a pilot in a helicopter circling the city. The perspective was dizzying. It was a kaleidoscope of terror and grayskin. We are the sight. The thought was a thunderclap. The helicopter, a news chopper trying to document the atmospheric anomaly, drifted too close to the Henderson Tower. I watched it through my own eyes, and the pilot's eyes, and the camera lens all at once. The black vapor didn't rise to meet the chopper. It simply manifested inside the cockpit. I felt the pilot's panic. I felt the sweat on his palms, the frantic pull of the flight stick. Then, the resonance hit. The glass of the cockpit didn't shatter. It turned black. The pilot's scream was cut short as his lungs filled with the oily silt of the entity. The helicopter didn't crash. The entity took the controls. The blades slowed to a rhythmic, unnatural thrum that matched the vibration in my marrow. The machine began to descend, not in a spiral, but in a controlled, predatory glide. It landed on the roof behind us. The pilot stepped out. He moved with the same grace as the rest of us. He walked to the edge of the roof and joined the line. We were growing. But then, something changed. A new frequency. It wasn't the entity's hum. It was a sharp, piercing electronic scream. From the north, 3 jets streaked across the dark sky. The military had finally arrived. I felt the entity's curiosity. It wasn't afraid. It was amused. The jets dropped their payloads. Long, silver canisters that tumbled through the black mist. They weren't bombs. They were DSBRS anti-S. The canisters exploded in mid-air, releasing a cloud of white chemical powder. It was designed to neutralize biological agents, to settle the dust. The white powder hit the black mist. For a second, the world turned gray. The chemicals reacted with the vapor, creating a hissing, caustic steam. I felt a sting on my skin, a faint, distant itch of mortality. The entity recoiled, not in fear, but in anger. The humming in my teeth became a roar. The vibration became so intense that the concrete beneath my feet began to crack. The entity didn't fight the chemicals. It absorbed them. The black mist turned to deep, bruised crimson. The jet pilots didn't have time to turn around. The entity reached out, not with vapor, but with gravity. I felt the air pressure on the roof drop to 0. My lungs collapsed, but I didn't need them. The jets, thousands of feet in the air, suddenly stalled. Their engines didn't fail, their wings didn't break. The air around them simply stopped supporting them. They fell like stones. I watched them hit the Hudson River, 3 massive plumes of water, followed by a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight. The military was gone. The chemicals were gone. The crimson mist began to settle back into its oily black state. But it was different now. It had tasted the resistance. It had tasted the iron of the jets and the fire of the fuel. It was evolving. I felt my own body shifting. The black fibers beneath my skin were hardening, turning into something closer to obsidian than flesh. My fingernails grew into long, curved talons of shadow. I wasn't just a vessel anymore. I was a weapon. The entity turned our collective gaze toward the bridges. The city was ours, but the world was waiting. We stepped off the roof. We didn't fall. We drifted, a slow, silent descent into the darkened streets. The march was beginning. We reached the pavement. The hollow were already moving toward the tunnels, toward the highways, toward the suburbs. The humming was no longer a sound. It was a command. Consume. Expand. Replace. I walked past a storefront window. I saw my reflection. I wasn't a man. I was a hole in the universe. And as I walked, I started to hum. Not because the entity forced me to, but because I wanted to. I was the hollow, and the hollow was me. The city was a hollowed out shell. a dark monument to a species that no longer inhabited it. We were moving now, a black tide flowing outward, past the concrete boundaries and into the soft green throat of the suburbs. The march was silent, thousands of feet hitting the asphalt in a single, rhythmic thud. The entity had synchronized our strides. We weren't a crowd, we were a landslide. I led the column crossing the George Washington Bridge. The steel cables above us weren't just metal anymore, they were conductors. The entity had threaded itself through the suspension wires, making the entire bridge hum with that sickly, violet resonance. Below us, the water of the Hudson had turned the color of old oil. I looked back. The Manhattan skyline was a jagged teeth of shadow against the sky that had forgotten the sun. There were no lights in the windows, only the pulsing, rhythmic glow of the entity's presence in the streets. We reached the Jersey side. The silence here was different. In the city, silence was a void. Here, it was a thread. The suburbs were waiting. We turned onto a residential street. Pristine lawns, white picket fences, 2 car garages. It was a museum of a life that was already extinct. The streetlights flickered as we approached. One by one, they didn't just go out. They exploded. The glass rained down on our shoulders like diamond dust. We didn't flinch. We didn't look up. We just kept moving. I felt a tug on my consciousness. A new signal from a house 3 doors down. A light was still burning. A 2nd-story window. The entity slowed our pace. It liked the light. Light meant life. Life meant fuel. We stood at the edge of the lawn, 500 of us, standing in the shadows of the oak trees, looking up at that single, yellow square of light. I felt the entity reaching out. It wasn't using the mist. It was using the ground. The grass beneath our feet began to turn black. The roots of the trees shriveled. The flowers in the garden beds wilted in seconds, their petals curling into ash. Inside the house, I heard sound, a muffled, frantic whisper. Is it gone? The entity laughed through my chest. It was a sound like dry leaves being crushed in a fist. I walked onto the porch. My boots didn't creak on the wood. I was too heavy now, too dense, my molecular structure reinforced by the void. I reached the front door. I didn't dissolve it. I didn't phase through it. I gripped the doorknob and crushed it. The metal turned to powder in my hand. I pushed the door open. The hallway smelled of floor wax and fear. It was a suffocating, sweet scent. I walked to the stairs. The entity moved my head, looking at the family photos on the wall. A man, a woman, 2 teenage boys. They were smiling. They were happy. They were obsolete. I reached the top of the stairs. The door to the bedroom was locked. I heard the sound of furniture being pushed against it. A barricade. I leaned my forehead against the wood. The resonance in my teeth spiked. I felt the vibration travel through my skull, through the door, and into the room beyond. I felt their heartbeats. 4 of them. Fast. Frantic. Failing. We know you're in there, I said. My voice was no longer human. It was a composite of every voice the entity had consumed. It was Sarah's whisper, Mr. Henderson's growl, the pilot's scream. We are ready for you. The furniture behind the door began to rattle, not because I was pushing, but because the atoms were reacting to the resonance. The wood of the dresser began to smoke. The metal of the bed frame began to glow. The door didn't break. It disintegrated. It turned into a fine, black soot that drifted onto the carpet. The family was huddled in the center of the room. The father was holding a baseball bat. The mother was clutching her sons. They looked at me. They saw the obsidian skin. They saw the void in my eyes. They saw the black vapor trickling from my fingertips like liquid ink. The father swung the bat. He was brave. He was desperate. He was slow. I caught the bat in midair. The wood shattered, not into splinters, but into dust. I reached out and grabbed him by the throat. I felt his pulse under my thumb. It was a weak, fluttering thing. You are not a man, I whispered. You are a battery. I opened my mouth. The vapor didn't pour out. It lunged. It entered his mouth, his eyes, his ears. His skin turned gray. His eyes turned black. He didn't fall. He stood up. He turned to his wife and sons. The mother screamed, a sound that lasted for exactly 3 seconds before the father's hand closed over her face. I walked out of the room. I didn't need to stay. The process was automatic now. The infection was self-sustaining. I walked back to the porch. The street was full of them. Every house was opening. Every door was swinging wide. The hollow were emerging from the suburbs, a new army of the damned. I looked up at the sky. The black clouds were swirling into a massive, rotating vortex, a storm of shadow that covered the entire tri-state area. And in the center of the vortex, I saw it, a single, blinding point of violet light. The entity's heart. It was coming down. It was no longer content with being a frequency. It wanted to be a presence. I felt my own heart stop, not because I was dying, but because I didn't need it anymore. The heart in the sky was my heart now. We turned toward the west. The suburbs were finished. The world was waiting. The expansion was no longer a crawl. It was a reclamation. As we marched west, the geography of the world began to bend. The trees in the New Jersey wilderness didn't just die. They transformed. Their bark turned to charcoal, their leaves to black glass that shattered in the wind with a sound like 1,000 tiny bells. The entity was rewriting the biology of the planet. It was terraforming the earth into a graveyard of obsidian and shadow. I reached the crest of a hill overlooking a major interstate. Thousands of cars were jammed in a static, metallic river. People had tried to flee, but the mist had traveled through the air filtration systems, through the cracked windows, through the very steel. They weren't dead. They were waiting. As I stood there, the entity sent a pulse through the marrow of my bones. Rise. The word didn't come from my throat. It came from the ground. It came from the air. Below me, thousands of car doors opened at the exact same moment. A synchronized, mechanical thud that echoed across the valley. Thud. Thud. The drivers stepped out. The passengers stepped out. They turned their heads toward the west, their black eyes reflecting the violet storm in the sky. They joined the march. The river of metal became a river of flesh and shadow. I felt the weight of them. I felt the connection stretching across the horizon. I was no longer an individual. I was a node. I was a lighthouse of the void, guiding the others toward the center of the storm. But then, I felt it. A resistance. Not from the humans. Not from the military. From the earth itself. Deep beneath my feet, the tectonic plates were vibrating. Not with the entity's resonance, but with a raw, primal, geological fury. The planet was trying to shake us off. The ground beneath the interstate began to buckle. A massive fissure opened, swallowing hundreds of the hollow in a single, jagged gulp. I felt their connection snap. I felt their screams, not in my ears, but in my nervous system. It was a void within a void. The entity stopped our march. The violet light in the sky flared with a blinding, hateful intensity. The clouds began to rotate faster, creating a vacuum that pulled the black mist upward into a towering, cyclonic pillar. The entity was fighting back. It wasn't using vapor anymore. It was using gravity. I felt the pressure in my chest double. My obsidian skin began to crack, revealing the pulsing, violet fire beneath. We are the foundation. The thought was a tectonic shift. The entity forced us to kneel. Thousands of the hollow, dropping to our knees on the cracked asphalt. We pressed our hands into the earth. The black fibers of our bodies didn't just touch the ground, they penetrated it. We sent our roots deep into the soil, through the clay, through the bedrock, into the very mantle of the planet. We were anchoring the entity. I felt the heat of the core. I felt the ancient, slow-moving consciousness of the earth. It was massive. It was powerful, but it was slow. The entity was fast. We injected the resonance into the planet's veins. We turned the magma to shadow. We turned the tectonic plates into conductors for the humming. The earthquake stopped. The fissure closed, crushing the hollow inside it and turning them into a paste of bone and obsidian. The earth went silent. It had lost. We stood up. Our hands were stained with a dark, glowing liquid that wasn't oil and wasn't blood. It was the essence of the world. We tasted it through our skin. It was bitter. The entity was satisfied. We turned back to the west. The horizon was no longer a line. It was a jagged, flickering wall of violet light. Beyond that wall lay the rest of the continent. The cities, the plains, the mountains. All of it was waiting to be emptied. I looked at my own reflection in a puddle of the black liquid. I didn't recognize the shape. The human silhouette was fading. My limbs were longer, my torso thinner, my head a smooth, featureless oval of black glass. I was becoming a pillar, a monument to the silence. I took a step forward. The ground didn't crunch. It vibrated. Every step I took was a broadcast. Every breath I didn't take was a vacuum. We reached the edge of a small town. The sirens were still wailing, a lonely, mechanical cry in the dark. I walked toward the town square. The entity wanted the bell tower. It wanted a megaphone for the end of the world. I climbed the stairs. They didn't creak. They dissolved under my weight. I reached the top. I looked out over the town. The people were huddled in the church. They were singing a hymn. The sound was faint, a fragile, human melody. I opened my mouth. I didn't let the vapor out. I let the humming out. The sound shattered the stained glass windows. It silenced the singing. I watched as the people in the pews dropped to their knees. I watched as their eyes turned black. I watched as the hymn became a resonance. The world was no longer a place of many voices. It was a place of one, and that voice was mine. The transition was no longer localized. It was geometric. As I stood atop the bell tower in that small, dying town, I felt the tether to my physical self snap like a frozen wire. My body didn't just feel light, it felt extended. I was no longer a man standing on a wooden floor. I was the floor. I was the stone of the tower. I was the air vibrating between the buildings. The entity was using my consciousness as a relay station, a central hub for the expansion. I looked at my hands, or what remained of them. They were long, spindly branches of matte black obsidian, pulsing with a rhythmic, violet glow that matched the heartbeat of the storm in the sky. The people in the church below had stopped singing. Their silence wasn't a lack of sound, it was a presence. They walked out of the heavy oak doors in a single, fluid line. They didn't look at the sky. They didn't look at me. They looked at the ground. They were listening to the heartbeat of the planet we had just broken. I felt a surge of energy from the north. Across the continent, other hubs were waking up. Chicago was a pillar of smoke. Los Angeles was a glowing, violet wound on the coast. The entity was connecting the dots, drawing a web of shadow across the face of the earth. We are the mesh. The thought didn't vibrate in my head. It vibrated in the atmosphere. The clouds above the town began to descend, heavy with the oily vapor. It wasn't rain. It was a physical, suffocating weight. It settled over the houses, the trees, the cars. Everything it touched was reclaimed. The wooden houses didn't burn. They fossilized. The paint peeled away in seconds, revealing the gray, stone-like substance beneath. The metal of the cars softened, flowing like mercury into the cracks in the pavement. The world was being stripped of its complexity. It was being simplified into a single, monochromatic landscape of shadow. I felt a disturbance, a tiny, insignificant spark of heat. From the edge of the town, a military convoy was approaching. They weren't using jets this time. They were using tanks, heavy, lead-line vehicles designed for nuclear fallout. They thought they could hide from the resonance. They thought the lead would protect them. The entity let out a low, vibrating chuckle through the bell tower. The sound shattered the remaining windows in the town square. I watched the tanks. They moved slowly, their treads grinding against the asphalt. They reached the town limits and stopped. A voice came over a loudspeaker. "This is a restricted area. Cease all hostile activity, or we will open fire." The entity didn't respond with words. It responded with a humming. I focused my gaze on the lead tank. I didn't reach out with my hands. I reached out with my intent. I sent the resonance directly into the lead. The metal didn't melt. It didn't explode. It vibrated. I increased the frequency. Inside the tank, I could feel the soldiers. Their lead-line sanctuary had become a microwave. The resonance was bouncing off the interior walls, amplifying with every microsecond. Their bones began to hum. Their teeth began to shatter. Their blood began to boil. I watched as the hatch of the tank flew open. A soldier tried to crawl out, his skin red, his eyes weeping blood. He didn't make it to the ground. The black vapor, which was now part of the very air, lunged into his lungs. He stiffened. He turned gray. He became part of the march. The other tanks didn't even try to fire. They couldn't. The electronic systems had been fried by the violet pulse. The engines had turned to slag. The soldiers inside didn't die. They were harvested. I felt their memories of training, of family, of duty, all being sucked into the central vortex. It was like watching a book being burned page by page. Then, the books were gone. The library was empty. The entity was satisfied. I stepped off the bell tower. I didn't fall. I floated, carried by the density of the air. I landed in the middle of the town square. Thousands of the hollow were waiting for me. They stood in a perfect circle, their heads bowed, their black eyes fixed on the ground. I walked to the center of the circle. The ground beneath my feet began to glow. The entity was ready for the final, global synchronization. It wasn't enough to take the cities. It wasn't enough to take the suburbs. The entity wanted the core. It wanted to turn the Earth into a giant, vibrating bell that would ring across the galaxy, calling the others. The others. The thought hit me like a physical blow. We weren't the only ones. The entity was just a scout, a vanguard. There were more. A whole universe of the hollow, waiting for the signal, waiting for the door to be opened. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of grief. Not for myself, not for the man I used to be, but for the universe. The silence wasn't a choice. It was a plague, and we were the carriers. The violet light in the sky became a blinding, white-hot glare. The earth began to shake, not with fury, but with surrender. I pressed my palms into the pavement. The resonance began to flow from my body into the world. One last time, the great, final ring. The frequency was now beyond human comprehension. It was a sound that could be seen, a light that could be felt, a weight that could be tasted. I was no longer a vessel. I was the frequency. The earth beneath me wasn't solid. It was a liquid, a vibrating ocean of shadow. I felt the resonance travel through the crust, through the mantle, hitting the iron core of the planet. The core didn't resist. It synchronized. The earth became a tuning fork. Across the globe, the oceans began to rise, not in waves, but in pillars. Massive, black columns of water reaching for the sky, mimicking the shapes of the hollow on the land. The atmosphere was turning into glass. The air was becoming so dense, so pressurized, that sound couldn't travel through it anymore. There was only the humming. I looked up. The black vortex in the sky had opened. Beyond the clouds, beyond the atmosphere, the stars were flickering. They weren't twinkling. They were responding. One by one, the stars began to turn violet. The signal had reached them. The others were coming. I felt my consciousness begin to dissolve. The final, tiny flicker of the man I was, the one who lived in that apartment, who watched the rain, who drank coffee. It was being stretched across the cosmos. I saw the history of the universe. I saw billions of worlds, all turning black. I saw billions of civilizations, all becoming hollow. It wasn't a war. It wasn't an invasion. It was an evolution. The complexity of life was a flaw. The individuality of the soul was a disease. The entity was the cure. We were bringing the peace of the void to every corner of existence. My body, the obsidian statue I had become, began to crumble. I didn't need it anymore. I didn't need a shape. I didn't need a name. I was the wind. I was the shadow. I was the silence. The earth let out a final, deep, resonant note, a sound that echoed through the vacuum of space. The song was over. The silence was complete. And then, I was gone. There was only the hum. The beautiful, perfect, eternal hum.